Just start right on 9 o'clock.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so hi everyone and welcome to the Connected Learning Summit for 2022. My name is Michael Dejuani. I'm a professor in digital media and learning at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce this initial opening plenary session. But before I do that, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands where I'm meeting from today. And I would invite you to think about the traditional owners of the lands where you're meeting from as well. At my university, we acknowledge the traditional owners and recognise that our university has always been a place of teaching and learning. And we also recognise that here in Australia, the lands that we're meeting on continue to be unceded territories as well. So it's really exciting to have this Asia Pacific time zone for the Connected Learning Summit. And again, I'd like to thank the organisers of the Connected Learning Summit for having the flexibility for us to have this Asia Pacific time zone. And these are all of the hosts of the Connected Learning Summit. And I won't read through all of these, I'll just draw your attention to them. These are the key partners in the Connected Learning Summit. We're on Hoover as our conference platform for this conference. And I'll just draw your attention to that one particular square there that's highlighted, which is ask the organisers anything at any time if you have any issues with the platform or you're not sure where to go and so on. Please don't hesitate to ask for assistance. This is the committee that has been organising the Connected Learning Summit this year. And I'd particularly like to draw attention to my colleague, Professor Hyun-Son Jeong from Korea, who, along with myself, has been helping to organise the Asia Pacific time zone sessions for the conference. These are the staff, and we'd like to thank the staff who have done an enormous amount of work to pull the summit together this year. It obviously takes a lot of effort to pull a summit like this together across time zones and to do it all online as well. So we thank everyone for that. So let me turn now to the opening plenary session. And so this session is called The Pandemic and Young People's Media Use and Learning. And I'm just going to stop my sharing for the moment now. Just give me 1 second while I adjust my screen here. Okay, so the session, I'd like to begin by saying it's not unusual at this point to talk about the pandemic and its impacts on schooling and education, of course. But I think we're still in that phase where we're trying to understand the nuances and complexities of how young people and their parents have experienced the pandemic, and indeed how they might continue to experience it Here in Australia, at least, we're not yet out the other side of the pandemic. We're still having many disruptions to schools. It's not, there's been ongoing talk about perhaps schools having to close again. So we're still in the midst of the pandemic, of course, but we're also in a position to begin to reflect on what has gone well and what hasn't gone so well. In this session, we've brought together 3 people who have been either at the front line of dealing with the pandemic and making connections to schools and education, or otherwise have been undertaking research in this area to try and understand what's been happening. So I'll just go through the 3 bios of our presenters to begin with, and then I'll pass over initially to Annabelle Asprey, who's going to lead off our presentation. But our 3 speakers today are, first of all, Annabelle Asprey, and Annabelle is Head of Education at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is our national broadcaster. It's like Australia's version of the BBC. So Annabelle leads an innovative and dedicated team to create, curate, and deliver media content for use in the classroom and at home. And she's an advocate for media literacy and was the executive producer of ABC Education's media literacy content and strategy. And she's currently chair of the Australian Media Literacy Alliance as well. Our second speaker will be Dr. Stephanie Smith. And Stephanie is the Manager of Learning at the Australian Museum of Democracy, which is in a building at Old Parliament House in Canberra, which was the seat of our national government for many years. Her work involves empowering young people to amplify their voice through the development of leadership skills, supporting solution-focused mindsets, and building media literacy skills. And then our third presenter is Dr. Rebecca Willett, who is Professor in the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Rebecca conducts research on children's media cultures, focusing on issues of play, literacy, identity, and learning. And her publications include work on makerspaces, playground cultures, amateur camcorder cultures, online gaming, and family media practices. And but very recently, she's been leading an international project looking at parenting during the pandemic. Okay, well, with no further ado, then I'm going to so each of our speakers will speak for about 8 or 9 minutes in turn, just to let us know who they are and how this topic relates to their work. And then I will follow up by asking some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions via the Q&A button, and I'll read out any questions that come up on Q&A. But we really do want the final third of this session to be an open conversation, so please get your questions ready, and that would be wonderful. So I'll now hand over to Annabelle. Thanks, Annabelle.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to all of the organisers of this wonderful event. I'm very excited to be here. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and very thankful that we can learn and love and live on the lands that they still care for. So as Michael said, I'm the Head of Education at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and we are a public service broadcaster. And like all public service broadcasters, one of the things at the heart of the remit of our charter is to educate all Australians. I've been really lucky enough for the last 10 years to really embark on a project that was one of the largest education projects in Australia, which started in 2012, where the ABC received funding and worked in conjunction with the Federal Department of Education to provide sorry, Sorry, my cats have just done something downstairs. I thought somebody was breaking in. So sorry about that interruption. So we worked with the Federal Department of Education, and the ABC was going to, and we did, digitize a lot of our archival content. And at the time, a new national curriculum was being implemented. And so we wanted to make sure that all of the ABC programming that we had could be mapped to the curriculum where possible, and to be curated in a way that was going to be used in the classroom. A lot of video back in 2012, I would still say that a lot of video wasn't being used in the classroom, and it certainly wasn't being used in short form format. But as the project developed over the years, and this is just, I'll get up to the pandemic and sort of how we handled that. What we worked out is that it was very advantageous for the audience if the ABC, as the national broadcaster, also partnered with some key cultural institutions. And we were then able to sort of expand our offering to the audience. So before the pandemic actually hit, we had very strong relationships with galleries, libraries, and museums. We also had a very good team who was able to curate a lot of the content that was being produced, particularly out of the factual area within the ABC. And we also had a group of talented producers around the country making their own stories, short form for educational audiences. And the consistent data that we've had over the last, particularly the last 7 years and before the pandemic, when we asked teachers how they used video in the classroom, it's an overwhelming, always over 85%. They always want short form content. So 3 to 5 minute clips. It's very rare in our surveys that when we ask the question, do you watch long form content in your classroom, like half-hour shows or 6-part documentaries? That's very few and far between. Unless, of course, you were in a subject like media studies where you might look at, feature films or some such. So I'll just share my screen just so you can just see our website and see where it was about. So this is the ABC Education website. We do have short form clips, mostly short form clips against all of the subject areas. And what happened when we got to the pandemic, I can tell you, so 13th of March in 2020, there was a very big wave of COVID happening in Melbourne, and I was feeling uneasy about sending staff into the office, especially when the disease was just sort of so rife. So I did make a decision on one Sunday night. I texted my team. I said, look, I really think we should sort of start working from home, just to be cautious and to be safe and to make sure that we don't get sick. And then a week later, all of the schools within Victoria, also in New South Wales, shut down, and learning at home was implemented across Australia. And for international visitors or members of the Connected Learning Summit who are watching, some of you may know that Melbourne sort of endured, I think it was the longest period of lockdown over the pandemic. Anyway, from the 20th of March, we had to get into sort of quick swing and work out, well, what's the public broadcaster's role in assisting students learning from home, teachers preparing to teach remotely, and also to support parents. So we had sort of 3 main initiatives. The first one was to extend the television broadcast educational programming across the day from 2 hours to 4 hours. And we had educational programming running from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, spanning a range of topics and year levels. And we think that's quite important because there's some communities within remote Australia who still don't have connectivity, or they have connectivity issues. And so broadcast is still, quite an important sort of feature in being able to access educational content. But we were also aware that schools were, supporting their communities, very strongly as well. The second thing that we had, we were in a good position anyway, in that we'd already had 4,000 resources mapped to the curriculum. So we saw, even though we had quite a good uptake of usage of our site within Australia, keeping in mind it's a very small market, only 10,000 schools, only there's 260,000 teachers. Like it's a very small market if you compare it to the United States, but we had a huge uptick. You can see those spikes in Google Analytics in what we did. But in order to enhance the offering, in addition to some of the 3,000 resources that we had on the site, we decided that we would also work with the departments of education to set up what we called a format called mini lessons. And mini lessons were short 7 to 10 minute lessons that were guided by active teachers in the classroom. And we worked with the education department to produce these mini lessons. And we really focused around English, maths and science. And it was mainly in the sort of the primary school area. And we had to go into a very quick sort of production mode, because we were using teachers who are not necessarily used to being in front of the camera, but we really wanted the authenticity and voice and actions of the teachers in the classroom. So we worked very closely with the teachers in the scripting of the content, in the practicing and rehearsal of their content. And within over a 2-month period, I think we had up to 40 mini lessons that we had with real practicing teachers within the classroom. And I don't think these are geo-blocked, but you're most welcome to look at them, and I can put the links into the chat later. So the funny, or well, it's not so much funny thing about the mini lessons. The mini lessons were a direct response to the pandemic and the learning at home situation, and to also support teachers and also to support parents. And one thing that the mini lessons really shone a light on was the fact that this is what teachers do. This is how they teach. So we had lots of feedback from parents who were like, oh, we had no idea this is how, we learned how to do fractions, or this is the way that we taught how to teach procedural writing. So it really sort of shone a light on the profession in itself, the professionalism of the teachers and the work that they actually do. It also supported parents at home too, when they were trying to understand sort of the curriculum and the way things were unpacked. For the teachers themselves, they were a very useful resource to direct parents to, but also to use themselves, so that in an online learning situation, they could refer to the short form video and then come back if they were, on Zoom or on Teams or any sort of remote learning activity that they were doing. But we did that in a very tight turnaround. And as you can see, we had to do things sort of remotely. We did them in real classrooms. That was the fortunate thing. There were no kids in school, so we could actually go into classrooms. But it was a very high pressure, challenging time. But I think the results that we got were excellent. And just a final note on that is that they're enduring. So the mini lessons are still some of our most popular content on the site that's being used today, even though schools are back so far to a pre-COVID situation. How are we going for time, Michael? I'm just just aware.
I think you have about 2 minutes, Annabelle.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So the other thing I just wanted to sort of conclude on, there's just a couple of things here. When we in Australia, we still noticed that there was a very big uptick in video on demand. So our video on demand service is called ABC iView, that is run by the public broadcaster. So we saw a very big uptick in the education section there, certainly to all of our online properties. there was an increase in the watching of the TV, the broadcast situation, but probably nowhere near as much as the uptake for online. I suppose that's, look, as I said before, yes, there are some communities that have poor connectivity, but the majority of Australia does have good connectivity and has access to devices. But it certainly did sort of shine a light on the fact that there is that division between people who do have devices and do have great connectivity. We found that the primary school resources were probably more used video resources within the pandemic as opposed to the secondary school resources. And I think that's because of the way that schooling is situated in Australia. And I just want one final note, and this is one thing that I'm very interested in that I think has really come out of the pandemic, and it's an area that I'm starting to do some research on, is sort of really challenging the notion of what traditional filmmakers might call edutainment. And I think as educators and as filmmakers, as creatives, we really sort of have to look at that genre and look where we can take it, seeing that we know that video and remote learning is certainly not going to go away like in a permanent fashion. So that's all I have to say. I've realized that I have not paid attention to any questions that have come through, but I'm very happy to answer any. And I also invite any of the participants in the Connected Learning Summit to reach out to me via social media or via the Hoover app to connect to discuss these things further. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Annabelle. And we'll turn to questions at the end after all three speakers as well. But thank you for your presentation. Okay, well, now I'll hand over to Stephanie from the Museum of Australian Democracy.
Hello everyone. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm connecting from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples here in Canberra, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As Michael said, I am the manager of learning at the Museum of Australian Democracy, which is located at Old Parliament House. We normally pre-pandemic have around 90,000 students that would visit us from across the country. We've also been in the digital space for about 5 years now, doing digital excursions. So for us, there was quite a big shift as schools went into remote learning and a lot of travel stopped as, states made changes to their rules and education departments deciding whether or not they would allow travel. And currently we're coming back up. We're still getting schools coming, but mostly from our neighbouring states here in next to Canberra. So that's New South Wales and Victoria, where Annabelle is, but most of the other states have chosen not to travel this year. So that significantly reduced our on-site visitation, which is very disappointing because we are part of a Canberra experience. It's essentially a rite of passage for all our Year 5 and 6 students to come to our nation's capital and visit Parliament House, visit us, visit the Australian War Memorial and a number of other culturals here. But it's given us a lot of opportunities in the digital space to really consider the programs that we offer and the experiences. And what we found was that teachers' perceptions really changed around their expectations of what they were getting when they were connecting to a digital program. And we got quite a lot of feedback around this, which really helped us to reshape our offerings and to make them better and more in line with what teachers were asking for to support them in the classroom. So what we found was that, as Annabelle had said, a lot of our teachers went to remote learning, and across Australia that was varying amounts. So for Victoria, it was a very long period of time. For some states like Western Australia, it was only a couple of weeks. But this shift allowed them to see what learning was like through the screen. And teachers are incredibly creative, you know that, in adapting to these changes. And so what we found was things that had worked really well in the past for us, essentially delivering a kind of tour experience. So moving through our historical spaces, delivering a lot of content around the museum, and asking questions that were a lot more closed. So relying on, you know, true and false questions to engage a whole class, or being very specific in asking questions like, what does democracy mean to you? I'll take 3 responses. So we came from a time where we were delivering all of this information, being very prescriptive in our content that we were delivering. And suddenly teachers were wanting more. They're asking for more variety and a lot more interaction in the digital experience. And so it really presented some wonderful opportunities for us to rethink the way that we were doing our digital programs. And so what we did was introduce a number of workshop programs. And the shift between our regular programming and a workshop is that the workshops rely a lot more on open-ended questions and dialogue between the classroom and our presenters, and responding to the direction that the students take our programs, and also an interactive component to our programs. So what you can see here on the screen is our digital studio. You can see Carly with a little whiteboard there. This is part of our Drawn Together program, which is exploring political cartoons. And Carly is co-creating a cartoon with the students. So the way that this program works is that we unpack different cartoons so they get those base skills, and then we invite them to co-create a piece, this one specifically that she's working on with her beautiful beret, if you can see it there, is around sustainability. And so it's putting those skills into practice, and then we give them an opportunity to create their own. We've also done experiences around sustainability as well. So we have an adorable bento box lunchbox, and we show the students our packed lunch for the day. We talk about the different types of single and soft-use plastics that are in there, and we wonder with them about the changes that we could make. So the idea with that excursion is that we're introducing them to sustainability and the power of their voice in making change, but also meaningful, manageable change. So we use the lunchbox specifically so that they can see that they can do something right now. They can make a simple change to their lunchbox to be able to participate in that. How do we create a better world for everyone? So we were really considering things that could be done at home, but also in a classroom setting as well. Now, this is one of my favorite things that we created during the pandemic. We worked really hard on these beautiful layered cartoons, and they're by a political cartoonist called Eric Lebecki, who mostly draws, he's in New South Wales. And the idea was this beautiful layered cartoon would play out over, say, 30 seconds, but we would then be able to go back and unpack it and talk about the different elements that help to create the cartoon, so that the students had those underpinning skills to then be able to analyze their own cartoons or be able to create content. So this one specifically to tie in with the Australian curriculum for us and to meet the Year 5-6 content around federation. So we were able to talk about the use of text, the use of symbols, the use of caricature, and the beginning of it has the absence of text as well, and play it out as the layers go through, which was really exciting for us and a great way to be able to engage students and create an experience that wasn't overwhelming. A lot of the political cartoons, we have a special exhibition that we run annually here on site where we pull a curated collection of cartoons from the previous year. And a lot of them to just look at can be quite overwhelming. There's just so much going on there and you have to know the issues, what's happening in the news at the time. And for us, that's a whole year past that we're asking them to remember events from. So this has been a great way for us to be able to build those connections and show them how they can be creative and use their artistic skills as well to talk about issues that they're passionate about. The other thing that we worked really hard on, especially with our team, was working smarter, not harder. And so whilst we've created this particular layered cartoon around federation, we also created one around sustainability. And so we've kept the main elements of our program the same, but we've been able to change out these key components to create a whole new program that speaks to a whole different audience. So that's been really great for our team because, you know, with the sickness that comes with the pandemic and requirements of staff to be at home, we're not adding programs to their remit. We're simply swapping out key bits so then they can easily pick them up and run a whole different experience. And it gives teachers that variety to be able to choose from as well. So with our lunchbox, with our You Mean Sustainability, we have one around the single and soft use plastics, but we're also working on one at the moment around Save the Trees and honeybees as well, to be able to give teachers that variety. The other thing that we introduced this year was we were getting a lot of requests from teachers about leadership programs. And so we've piloted a program this year. And the idea is that we do repeated connections with a school. So with all of our normal digital experiences, it's a 1 hour session, essentially. We connect with about 30 students so we can have that high engagement with them. This program, the idea is we connect at least once a term with them, and that we co-plan with the teachers as well to really target an experience that works for them. And it gives me a lot of information about what's happening in the classroom and the kind of activities and resources that teachers are looking for. So this particular leadership program actually goes over the whole day. And we've embedded it into an inquiry model, and there's not actually much of us on the screen. So the first half hour is this inspiring, talking about young people, how they're making a difference in the world, seeing some of the spaces at the museum and getting to know our presenter. And then we send out a pack. So that's what you can see in the picture here, is the students have activity sheets in front of them, and we send out these incredible card castle pieces that they work on during the day. And so we've set up each section of the day with a different inquiry focus. So the morning is all about what is leadership and who are leaders. The middle of the day is who am I as a leader, which is where they complete the card castle piece. And the afternoon is how can we lead together? So this program's been very interesting because we've picked up not only your normal school representative councils, but we've picked up STEM champion groups. We've also picked up whole years. So we've picked up whole year 5, 6 classes. So we've run this with, 45, 50 students. And it's a lot of them doing activities through the day and then reconnecting with our presenter and talking through what they've created. So that's been really exciting. And now we're moving into the what's next. And that has changed between different schools. So some schools, we spend an hour with them every Wednesday morning, and we're running a program when they have their normal leadership timetable. We've got another one where we're focusing on women in leadership for our next module. So that's been really exciting to really be able to start to craft experiences around inquiry and around project-based learning, and really think about the language that we're using in our digital experiences. So we do a lot of wondering with students. We do a lot of very open-ended, what do you notice when we go into spaces, or if we're looking at posters. So you can see behind my head, there's a democracy poster. This is so accessible for young people because it's visually beautiful, lots of keywords. And so we will ask them to tell us, you know, what stands out to you? What do you think is important in this image? So that's been exciting from that shift perspective of being very prescriptive about what we're asking during our digitals, and pulling a lot of information from Kath Murdoch and Trevor McKenzie, but also from Ron Rickard around visible thinking as well, and really considering the types of questions that we're asking in our digital experiences. And I think one of the most powerful things that we've realized in connecting is that they don't actually need to tell us all of the information. I think that was a kind of aha moment where we realized that we could have students turn and talk like they do in the classroom, and that it was way better for them to share with each other and not necessarily have to feed that back through the camera, that it was okay that they were sharing ideas, and that we didn't need to know all of them and validate them. So I think that's been wonderful for our team to really take on these ways through our workshops and our pilot program, and then shift that into our normal programming, which is now translated into how we change our on-site as well. So there's been lots of positive for us.
Definitely.
Yes.
Sorry, I think, can we just leave it there, because that's a really good point to stop on, I think, about that shift in the pedagogy. I'm just aware of time.
Yes.
So we might just, and of course, if there are things that you wanted to finish up with, we can perhaps come back to those in the Q&A time.
No,
But
you're
that's
all good.
really wonderful. Thank you. So I'll hand over to you now, Rebecca, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Steph.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me here and coming across different time zones. It's a pleasure and an honor to be presenting today. I want to acknowledge that the UW-Madison resides on the unceded territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a land they have called Deja for around 14,000 years. I acknowledge the learning that I need to do to understand my relationship to this very meaningful and beautiful place that I enjoy, as well as my relationship to the Ho-Chunk Nation. So I will start my presentation here with this screen. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see this unless Michael tells me otherwise. So I will be sharing some findings from a project about family media practices during the pandemic. It was fun to hear the other side, who was producing the media, because I have the consumption side. So this is an ongoing project that currently includes about 120 interviews with parents and caregivers of children in the younger school age range from ages 4 to 11 that we're collecting in 7 different countries, you can see on the screen, and with an amazing and wonderful group of researchers. So, as we heard, it's no surprise, children's media use increased dramatically in the pandemic. Parents in all the countries in the study reported having to supervise their children's remote schooling, and parents all reported more media use because there were no extracurriculars to occupy children when parents were trying to work and care for each other and do household chores. There were fewer options for family entertainment. Even playgrounds were closed down. Socializing was all being done on screen. So lives became even more digital by default. This image represents a very idealized vision for remote learning and for children's media use. In contrast, What we heard is more like this. We found parents talking about trying to, work on their laptop, make arrangements on the phone at the same time, trying to entertain younger children while supervising their older children's virtual learning. Oh, and note there's breakfast going on at the same time. So parents in all the countries reported this very stressful situation of supervising children's remote schooling at a time when they were trying to cope with work, with health, with family separation, and so on. So I presented these two extremes. What we found is there's a lot more complexity in terms of parent support of remote schooling. So I'm going to share an initial analysis very briefly of parent interviews in the UK and the US that I've done with Dr. Becky Coles in the UK. We will be using this framework to compare with the situation in other countries, primarily South Korea. But today I'm only able to discuss these two countries, UK and US. So both of these countries had multiple lockdowns and several periods of time when schooling went remote. In Madison, it was over a year. So both countries talked about remote schooling, and we found parents falling into these four categories that you see on the screen here that I'll talk through. Now, a variety of factors who fell into these categories very roughly. So things like socioeconomic status, their employment status, how many children were in the home, how old those children were, whether or not they had a child with special needs, the availability of grandparents. And there were many factors that made these four positions more or less available to the families that we interviewed. So starting with the will do it parents, these were the routine followers. They were able to follow the school's remote learning plans and schedules. So these parents could spare a parent. These families could spare a parent from work, or they didn't have younger children to be looking after, so that they could really focus on supporting their children's remote learning. They followed a daily routine set by schools, but this was a lot of hard work. Parents had to figure out numerous applications. They had to log in with different passwords. They often had to download something, have their kids fill it out, upload a video. And of course, the kids were constantly trying to kind of find workarounds and bend the rules, as kids do. The next category is the can't do it parents, the parents who were just simply overwhelmed and really unable to support their children's and the school's remote learning. So parents who were simultaneously trying to work and care for multiple children, parents who had kids with special needs, and so on. So single mothers fell into this category as they were trying to keep their family income and support remote schooling. These parents expressed a lot of sense of guilt and frustration, and these feelings were really fueled by discourses about, very dominant discourses about learning loss during the pandemic, and also media effects like too much screen time. Next is the won't do it. These were the refuseniks, really, the disruptors. They refused to take on the position of a teacher and mediate schoolwork. So some of them said something along the lines of, my children need me to be a parent right now and not a teacher. But there were different kind of positions. So disruptors found alternatives to parent supervision of remote learning. They would hire a tutor. They might pay for kids to go to schools that were in session. Private schools in the States were face-to-face. They might opt for homeschooling, pull their kids out of the school system. So obviously, this is a privilege in different kinds of ways to be able to be a disruptor. And then the final categories are those parents who said that I can do it better. They were the compensators. They did what the school asked, But they felt their kids needed something extra or something different. So there were concerns that the work was too easy, or it was inappropriate for their children, concerns about too much screen time, concerns about lack of social interaction. So they adapted or supplemented the work that the school set. So these are observations about challenges with formal remote learning offered through schools. We also documented new understandings of informal learning connected with children's digital media. So families spent a lot of time engaging with media. And so parents in our study reported having a really much better understanding about their kids' learning and about their digital media use. So many parents reference pre-pandemic, very strict screen time limits that they apply to any, in a blanket way to any exposure to screens. Of course, that had to get modified during the pandemic. And so parents were forced to make much more nuanced distinctions connected with screen use. So parents discussed different purposes for children's media use during the day. There was leisure screen time, there was family movie night, social time, kind of informal educational stuff, very formal kinds of things, piano lessons, for example. They expressed much more subtle understandings of media content. So social content, for example, games were recognized, acknowledged as social spaces. They thought more about different types of engagement. So media that were more passive or more active and social. And all of these were much more nuanced understandings and distinctions compared with the previously indiscriminate 2 hours of screen time that they had tried to follow. We heard about connected learning, learning lots of new skills outside the school through online spaces, developing creative pursuits, supporting children, finding ways to support their interests, using screens for well-being, for yoga, for cooking, for engaging in art. And we heard parents talking about their new understandings of children's digital behaviors. So play and production practices were featured. They were surprised that children are able to self-regulate their media time. Children respected content boundaries that the parents set. They also found out that their kids know a lot of workarounds and were constantly kind of pushing the boundaries to do more workarounds. They expressed concerns and kind of surprised at their kids' ability to multi-screen. So I think one of the silver linings, and I'll end here, is of the pandemic is that parents might be making more informed decisions about children's media use in the future. So this is the last slide. If you'd like more information, please feel free to contact me. Also, for a very deep experiential kind of experience of the data, I've put a short URL of our showcase, which is a metaverse that you can explore with lots of kind of carefully curated data from this project that is part of Connected Learning. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And that just such fascinating research. And perhaps I might ask if you have access to it to put that URL into the chat so that people can access it directly from there rather than from the slide. So I, just being conscious of time, I just have one sort of follow-up question, and it's for Annabelle, or of course anyone can comment on this question as well, and then I'll turn to some questions that we have already from the audience. And please, if you if there are others out there who would like to ask a question, please put that into the Q&A for us. So my question is about digital inclusion. And Annabelle, you talked about this. You talked about the fact that in Australia, we have some groups who are very obviously digitally excluded. So for one thing, in some remote parts of the country, it remains the case that you simply still can't get a physical connection to the internet. But even within cities, we know that for low-income families in particular, that there's a significant number of, or a high percentage of families who are in that low income bracket who have either no access to the internet or very limited access to the internet. So I think one of the really interesting things to come out of the ABC's response to the pandemic was that we did have to return to broadcasting, and which, you know, is sort of in this digital age is kind of in some respects a little bit shocking, I suppose. But on the other hand, you know, we do have this wonderful history of broadcasting high quality content. So I just wanted to ask you if you would like to comment further on that kind of question about digital inclusion and the role of a public broadcaster in relation to that.
Yeah. Well, I think it is the remit of the public broadcaster to, you know, inform, educate and entertain, you know, all Australians or all of the audiences where there are countries that have public broadcasters. I think one thing that it showed, like if we're looking future, like, I mean, if we're future focused, like, I mean, we know that broadcast audiences are declining, but I think we have to look at that there is still going to be some broadcast and there is going to be some access issues, and we have to really re-examine what sort of educational content that we're putting up and that's going to be accessible and usable for people at home and for practitioners in the classroom. As far as in terms of like access, we've got a very strong history of School of the Air in Australia. So in some ways, those remote communities have been served very well for many years. And like in Victoria, we have a really great remote learning school who'd been sort of doing this practice, you know, all along. So we've got those issues, but it's certainly at the time, and Rebecca alluded to this as well, especially the management at home by parents, especially for those in low income families where you don't have multiple devices, or you might not have devices at all. But it's not even having the access to the devices, it's about having the connectivity as well. So even if schools are sending home devices, if you don't have access to high band, you know, broadband, you're really disadvantaged in that respect. But one thing that I did see, and I'm, you know, must applaud that we know that school communities really did sort of extend and try to serve the needs and understand the needs of the students and families, you know, who they serve.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Annabelle. So I'm going to turn to one of the questions from the Q&A now. And Stephanie, I think perhaps you might be in a good position to answer this one. So this is a question from Mimi, which is about, you know, is there any backlash to digital, and is there a kind of rush? Are people wanting to rush to a return to normal? So you talked about the fact that it is a rite of passage, for instance, for children to go to Canberra to have that in-person experience. You know, are we going to just rush back to that, or do you think some of what we've learned from digital will continue on into the future?
There is definitely a push to come back to on-site. We see with our schools that they'll give us 2 weeks notice of their cancellations because they're so keen to hold on to their bookings. And we see them try and rebook, and sometimes that's 4 goes. So we can absolutely see that schools are very, very keen to be able to come back to the museums, because you can't get that experience online. You can't sit in the seats where the politicians used to work, and you can't experience the exhibitions here in Canberra. But I think there is absolutely a place as well for online. We tried really hard with our programming to create different experiences that complement what they do on site. For example, yesterday we ran a big digital webinar around a book called Camp Canberra, which looks at visiting all of the culturals And we had around 3,000 students connect with us, and a lot of teachers were using it as a pre-visit activity so that they could see some of the places they were going to visit in Canberra. And also we made it available so it was broader to cover all of those states who won't travel at all, so they were getting some sort of experience of the national capital as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn to a question now from the chat from Hyunsun. And this is about, you know, who made all of this wonderful content. So I suppose, Stephanie, in your case, at the museum, you know, is there a team that's there making this high quality content? And I think also, Annabelle, from the perspective of the ABC, you know, in getting these teachers in to be part of these mini lessons, you know, there was a lot of hard work that went into that. And I think, you know, this relates to the ongoing presence of high quality digital content for the classroom, even as we turn back to in-person mode. So Annabelle, perhaps if you could comment on that first.
Yeah, well, I wish I had a team of 5,000 producers, but in reality, it was we had in the first tranche of mini lessons that we did, I had 2 producers. So I had 1 camera person, and because of COVID restrictions too on production, we could have only limited people within the recording space. So we had a camera person and a director there on the day. Quite a bit of work, all the work, preparation work was done online beforehand, and the department put forward and recommended teachers who were experts in the areas that they were working with. So it was a fairly sort of skeleton staff, but they were staff that were within my education team in terms of making the content, and the teachers then just stepped in. Yeah.
And Stephanie, how did it work at the museum?
We were even more under-resourced than Annabelle, and it's just our beautiful educators. So it was us learning new skills. I can do a minor edit by myself, but I'd love a good editor to help us with our backlog of content. But it was just us in the studio practicing, learning new skills, which was really exciting for our team to have those opportunities and to be able to upskill. But yeah, I appreciate Annabelle's small team there.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a question now from Amanda Levito for Rebecca. I'll just read this one out, and then I see you've already answered it in the chat, Rebecca, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate a little bit. Did you find that families were rigid in how they approached home learning? For instance, did families stay in one of the 4 categories, or did that change maybe over time, or even depending on what was going on in their lives?
Yeah, exactly. The context of every family was so different, you know, even within the same city, right? And it changed over time. You know, the Colombian researcher is still interviewing, so it's been over 2 years. And so, yeah, these are pretty rough categories, but definitely we heard parents talking about how they tried to follow to be the will-do-its. And they came to a crisis point, you know, they got COVID, or, you know, many reasons they were furloughed. So many reasons that they would reach a crisis point, and they had to figure something out and just say, look, I mean, school here was not required for that first year. So parents could just say, like, I can't do it, I'm not going to try anymore. So yeah, parents definitely reached a crisis point. Again, if you go into the metaverse, you'll feel that crisis, these crises.
And then I might just follow up with this other question for you, Rebecca, from Mimi, which was, you said that parents might make more informed decisions about media moving forward. Will you be doing any research on that? And she's also super curious about whether those more nuanced and less judgmental approaches to tech or media will outlast the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what kind of started my curiosity about this project. And this was a very kind of ground up project. I was like, I have all this travel money I'm not using. Can I use that money to pay parents to talk to me? And so that's what drove it, is like, they must be shifting their ideas about media and kids as they themselves are using more media, and they're watching their kids, and they're, like embroiled in these like small spaces, right? And so again, so much time passed since the, March 2020, between then and when we interviewed parents. I interviewed parents within 9 months of the start of the pandemic. But even, now the kids, a 4-year-old now was only 2 when the pandemic started, right? And so of course, parents' practices, media practices, are going to be very different between a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And that's what the parents primarily said, was their practices inevitably are going to change. And so it's very hard for them to discern like what is the result of their kind of new understandings. But they did, as I said, definitely reflect. There are a lot of aha moments where parents are like, oh, I'm telling my child not to do that. And then I look down at my hand, right, and see the phone. And so there is a lot more reflection, self-reflection, as well as really deep observations, right? Like someone said, I finally understand Let's Play videos and what the pleasure is of that. So as I put in the Q&A, what I would love to be a next step is to kind of really think how to support parents in these reflective practices, how to get parents to be kind of anthropologists in their own home, right? Observing their own practices, reflecting on their own practices and media consumption, as well as really just kind of sitting back and watching all the cool stuff that kids are doing.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think that's a really great point to end on, because we are at time. I really want to thank Annabelle, Stephanie, and Rebecca for giving us their time today for this fascinating conversation. We are going to continue this conversation in a meetup that starts in about half an hour's time, if you can make it to that. There's another meetup a little bit later today from for the Asia Pacific region as well, that everyone's also very welcome to come to. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this session, and I look forward to catching up with you throughout the rest of the summit. So thank you very much, and we'll catch you later. Bye-bye.